千里之行，始于足下. A journey of 1,000 miles begins beneath the feet. We now gather in the Tao to travel the journey together. Welcome to Tao Talks with Derek Lin, where we take a deep dive into the Daodejing by Lao Zi. I would like to invite you to center your thoughts and direct your attention to this moment in time, to the here and now. To be fully present and mindfully aware as we all ready ourselves for this sacred process of the Tao. I want to ask everyone to watch out for the following. There are people who study and or teach the Tao that talk about how, well, there are so many different versions of the Daodejing. Which one do you use? And they will then talk about the version that they use, showing off knowledge. They can talk, for instance, about the oldest version known of the Daodejing, and there's actually several. And these older versions were unearthed by archaeologists from ancient tombs. And they go back to within just 100 or 200 years of the time of Lao Tzu. And so examples include He Shang Gong, Ma Wang Dui. These were all ancient tombs where copies of very old, very ancient Daodejing have been uncovered. So these were the multiple versions that are often cited. Now, the idea, remember, is to assert the ego by introducing complexity and uncertainty, which is the one to use. Now, let me first explain why there were multiple versions to begin with. Back in the days of Lao Tzu, 2,500 years ago, this was before the invention of paper. So writing medium was not easy to come by. So sometimes people wrote in silk, sheets of silk, obviously much more expensive to produce than the paper that would later be invented. Sometimes people would cut bamboo strips and then tie them together to form a writing surface. So writing surfaces being rare and relatively expensive, people had to be very careful in abbreviating what they want to express. And this contributes to the overall brevity of the Daodejing itself. The other factor is that there was no printing press. Obviously not. There wasn't even paper. With the lack of automated printing press, everything had to be copied by hand. When people copy things by hand, you often end up with inaccurate, distorted, or incomplete results. This was the case for the Ma Wangdui manuscript. And that is what introduces multiple variations. Even when you copy from an authoritative version, you could end up with mistakes in yours. And you could copy it out of order. You could copy the last chapter first, the first chapter last, etc. You could mix it up. The other great factor is that when people saw the hand-copied versions of the Daodejing back in those days, if they were Tao sages themselves, they would instantly understand what Lao Tzu was trying to accomplish. Lao Tzu was trying to compile this compendium, this summary that summarized the existing wisdom that was known up until that point in time. So when they saw that, and they themselves having studied the ancient Tao as well, they would add things that they knew about, but that Lao Tzu perhaps did not know about. This also introduced additional variations. Now, the multiple variations were eventually unified, and this was about 700 years after, 700 or 800 years after the time of Lao Tzu. They were all standardized, and there was a scholar, a young scholar who had access to all these different versions of the Daodejing. So with access to these ancient versions, which we no longer have, he could see where the changes were made, where the variations took place, and he could consolidate them. He could, for instance, weed out mistakes. So this was eventually known as the Huangdi version. And that version, the standardized version, has been in use for well over 1700 years. That's the version that most people would standardize on, and rightfully so. And it is possible Huangdi is very close to Gong, so those two versions could be used together. Whereas the Ma Wangdui version, the one from this tomb belonging to a noble, well, that one appeared to be a practice copy of the actual, original, authentic Daodejing, and therefore it should not supplant the effort of later scholars who unify the versions into the correct version. Anyhow, the bottom line for all of us is that we just have to know that it's actually quite simple. We just have one unified standard version now. There's still going to be, human beings are imperfect. So when we transmit or copy or study these versions, there may be a few characters off here and there. You know, I see that myself. But there's always an accurate version that is 99% the same as other accurate versions. That's what we can work from. So it doesn't have to be complicated. So beware of people who try to make it complicated when it doesn't have to be. Second, there are also people who teach, people who study, who will talk about, oh, well, you know, every single line of the Daodejing has numerous interpretations. That is actually false. Let me explain why that is a mistaken statement. Throughout the entire Daodejing, the vast majority of the lines, the meaning is clear. The meaning is specific. It's been explained since ancient times in countless commentary volumes. Countless scholars came and went and put in their own notations on what an original line actually meant. So for the majority of them, there's widespread consensus on what they mean. Pretty much, it's not controversial at all. There are a few lines that can be interpreted in maybe 2 ways or 3 ways, but most of the lines have one valid interpretation that is agreed upon for centuries. This is why I say not all interpretations are equally valid. The vast majority of the freewheeling interpretations we see in the West are actually wrong. The majority of them are actually distorted or misunderstood. And let me use an example to explain what I mean by most lines have agreed upon interpretations. If you think about the Bible, the Christian Bible, well, it's from ancient times. It's gone through many versions. There are many versions of it still. And there are numerous interpretations. But for most of the Bible, the meaning of the lines are not controversial. If you were to study Sermon on the Mount, you're going to see that most people, most Christian scholars, would readily agree upon the meaning and the message that comes from Sermon on the Mount. Okay, it's not controversial. There aren't, 100 interpretations of that. The meaning is pretty clear. It's like that with the Daodejing. And then number 3, there are also people who say this. Well, every Chinese character has multiple definitions. So what they're trying to say is that look at how many versions of Daodejing there are, look at how many interpretations per line there are, look at how many definitions per character there are, and therefore altogether the complexity multiplies until you have basically an infinite number of possible interpretations of the Daodejing. And again, I'm going to have to say no, no, and no, or false, false, and false. Look at this claim here for just a moment. In the image that I have in this slide to the lower right-hand side, that is just a snapshot of one page from a Chinese dictionary. It's similar as an English dictionary, except that, of course, it's all in Chinese. And yes, many Chinese characters have multiple definitions, but I could say the exact same thing for English words. Many English words have multiple definitions. Look in any English dictionary and you will see that. This aspect of the Chinese language is no different from English or any other language. Many, but not all words have multiple definitions. Some have just a limited definitions. Some words have only one definition. Now, despite the fact that we have many words with multiple definitions, I want to note that we are now conversing in English. We manage to communicate every day using the English language clearly, getting the message across most of the time, being understood, despite the fact that many words have multiple definitions. The trouble that we get in language in general, English or otherwise, is the game of telephone. When one person conveys the same message to another person, it's not from multiple definitions of words. Now, of course, sometimes we can be confused by the multiple definitions. Sometimes we creatively will use that as a pun or make a joke out of it. But in that regard, it's just like any other language. Chinese is no different. Lastly, let me just point out the dictionaries, the Chinese dictionaries that we have, they're no larger or more complex than English dictionaries. Languages of the world serve a particular need, and that is communication. They are complex enough to convey nuance of meaning, but that's it. They are no more complicated than they need to be. Same with Chinese, just another language. All right, so lastly, just to finish off this slide, I also want to talk about people who study or teach the Tao in the West will sometimes talk about feelings, using feelings as a judge. Like, okay, well, Derek, I hear what you're saying. I understand everything that you say has basis in reality. You study this stuff, you can read the original, okay, great, but I feel like this interpretation is accurate. I feel like this meaning is, this is what appeals to me, this is what strikes me as true. Well, let me say this, regardless of our feelings about certain lines, the original meaning that has been agreed upon for centuries, that doesn't change, regardless of personal feelings. There is, in language, right and wrong, intended, unintended, beyond the feelings of the person who hears the message. Now, it's the same in all human communication. Think about the red light and green light that we have in traffic stops. I can feel differently about them. It doesn't change the agreed upon meaning that red light means stop, green light means go. We agree on that for most of us, so civilization can function. And if you think about it too, I can make a case for red being a positive thing. I can say, well, note how in Chinese culture, red is the color of celebration. It is the color of life because it is the color of blood. So a reddish hue is a very good thing, and therefore, why wouldn't I? Why wouldn't I look at the red lights and say that means go? Signals are go. I'll let that represent the signal to go. Well, I'm making a case for it. I have feelings about it. It doesn't change what has been agreed upon by most people, so civilization can function. So my final message is that when you encounter people like that, oftentimes they will be overusing a lot of jargon. They will use jargon without explanation just to be able to sort of project an area of superiority. Look at all these terms I know that are not known to the public. When you see anyone like that, anyone talking about these 3 points here, I would say again, beware. This is an example of somebody complicating the Tao that was meant to be simple. Our meeting has come to an end, but the journey continues on. Let us all travel safely so we can meet again. Until next time, may the Tao fill you with peace and happiness.